Hello, everyone, and welcome to another exciting history segment for the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute. That's PBBI from Fresno State. And we kind of titled this, who we are, because what Dr. Monique Kelly-Vallance gives us is a part of a history that we've been doing now for almost 3 years. And part of the history of Portugal. And if you have any roots in anywhere in Portugal, whether it's something that happened 500 years ago or 900 years ago or just the last century, it is who we are. It shaped us. That's what history does, whether people believe that it does or it doesn't. And of course, we're doing this through Facebook Live. We're going to be on YouTube as well and on SoundCloud because the Portuguese American Hour has officially come to an end at the end of 3 years, part because the station was sold to another conglomerate that is going to be doing, of course, something different. So the multicultural segment of the station no longer exists. Well, Monique, first and foremost, thank you so much for all of these episodes that we've done on radio. We have them archived, which is great. Now folks will have them, and should say this is not totally new because we've been doing these off and on. About every 2 or 3 weeks, we've been doing them on Facebook Live as well and archiving them. So first and foremost, thank you for joining us today, but thank you for the last almost 3 years as well.
Well, no problem. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to do this because I
You
really
know,
like it.
well, I know. Well, I don't know if you enjoy it, but I think you do because you're excited about it. But we certainly enjoy it. I I've been away from teaching, as you know, in person for a few semesters, and I just began face to face at one class at Fresno State, and then of course one class at COS because they threatened to close the program if I didn't teach it. So it was either teach it or we don't have time to go find anybody else. And so this was what happened. And I had an interesting compliment yesterday as we were leaving the class. A student told me and said, I enjoy this class. You're really animated. So I guess us Portuguese like to be animated when we teach.
That's good.
But more than animation, you give us wonderful history. And what are we going to learn today?
Well, okay. So I saw a news article the other day that inspired me for today's. And so we are coming up on the 200th anniversary of Brazilian independence. And something that people may not realize has been happening is that Dom Pedro IV of Portugal was also the first emperor of Brazil. And his heart has been laying in rest in port. And so the president of Brazil, in order to celebrate the independence, asked Portugal if he could borrow the heart. And so they took it out. It's been in formaldehyde all this time. And so they put it on display in Portugal for the last couple of weeks. And just yesterday, it landed in Brazil to a lot of fanfare and Air Force shows and things like that. And so I thought that, you know what, we're coming up on the anniversary. Might as well talk about the independence of Brazil.
And I'm glad that you're doing that because, as a matter of fact, just before you start, it leads me to tell everyone listening and watching that we, along with the college that's right next to your door there in Modesto, which is California State University Stanislaus. Both us and Renato Alvim from Stanislaus are putting together a program. It's going to be for 5 days in late September. We'll have dates in just a little bit on the bicentennial because it's an important event and it's important for the Brazilians, but it's certainly important for the Portuguese as well.
Yes. And it actually, I mean, if you look at it, it's the only country in Latin America to gain its independence relatively quickly and not become a democracy. And a lot of it has to do with the events that led up to it.
Sure.
So it's a really interesting story.
So tell us what happened there with Dom Pedro, because he always has fascinated me when he says, yes, I'm just going to stay here.
Yeah.
I kind of like it here.
And this story actually involves a lot of my favorite characters. So if anybody who knows me, even though primarily my focus has been early modern, medieval Europe, Napoleon is one of my favorite historical characters, and not because of his military prowess, but, his personal life, but he just cracks me up. And, anyway, so this kind of goes back to Napoleon and his rivalry with England. So just for a tiny bit of background, so people can kind of understand where we're coming from, when Napoleon was very powerful in France at the time and became emperor of the French in 1804, He would look like he was on track to have conquered or gained alliances with all of Europe. And by 1807, the only countries that he was not either had already conquered or had an alliance with was Spain, Portugal, and England. And of course, England was his main target. He had tried to send a navy against England, but he was soundly defeated because while being an awesome army general, the French Navy was not as proficient. And of course, it's easy to defend yourself when you're on an island. So Napoleon knew the only way he could defeat England was to do it through their pocketbook. I mean, for anybody who knows England, the only thing that they grow naturally there is fog and sheep. So you can't really do much with that. And one of England's biggest trading partners was Portugal. So Napoleon in 1807, his troops invade Spain. He arrests the king, Ferdinand VII, and puts his brother Joseph as king of Spain, which, ironic. Then the following year, Joseph ran away from Spain, took all the crown jewels with him, and ended up buying a big house in New Jersey. Looking for and it's kind of the thing with Napoleon. If he conquered a country, he'd put one of his siblings as the king or the queen. So anyway, so the end of 1807, now that they've conquered Spain, they're threatening Portugal, and so his marshals are on the border of Portugal, and they send a message to the Portuguese court. Now, at the time, Dona Maria I was technically the queen, but she was not in any conditions to rule, as she was, not mentally stable. And her son João, who ends up being João VI, was the Prince Regent at the time. So he gets this message from the French that says either stop trading with England or we will invade Portugal and we'll arrest you too. And Napoleon had plenty of siblings, so he'll put somebody else as king of Portugal. Now, of course, the English didn't want Portugal to do that because Portugal was the last holdout. And of course, England did depend on Portugal quite a bit for trading. So the English kind of get themselves involved. And João doesn't really, he's between a rock and a hard place. You give in to Napoleon, we lose trading with the English, or you don't give in to Napoleon. And said, we have a great idea. Why don't you go to Brazil? Hang out there for a little while. Let us take care of Napoleon for you. We'll run things here in Portugal. When Napoleon is defeated, we'll give you a call. You come back and everything will be good. And João was like, great, that's an awesome idea. I don't have to deal with it. So he gets on his ships at the end of 1807 with Dona Maria, his mother, who supposedly went to the ship screaming, "Ai Jesus, ai Jesus."
I take it she wasn't excited about getting on that cruise ship.
I don't think so. And we have to remember, people now think like, oh, Rio, like I'm going to be on the beach in the Copacabana. But we have to remember that in the 1800s, it's still a backwater. And never, ever in the history of the Americas, actually, there had never been a monarch, any European monarch had ever stepped foot in one of the colonies anywhere, ever. So this is major. The fact that he's not only leaving the country, but he's going to one of the colonies is just insane. So the whole court, the nobles, everybody, the treasury, they all take off, they sail to Rio, and they end up in Rio in January of 1808. And what's crazy about this is that, this is actually the beginnings of Brazilian independence, because for a king or a queen, still, she doesn't die until later, but for a monarch to be in the colony is unheard of and is beneath them, right? So they actually had to raise Brazil to the status of being part of the kingdom at that time. And so Brazil stops being a colony in 1808. Technically, and then officially in 1810. So now it's the Kingdom of Portugal, the Algarve, and Brazil. So right away, this is a big deal for Brazil, and the Brazilians are so excited. You have a lot of people living in Brazil who either came from Portugal or were descended from people who were born in Portugal, and they're wealthy. They have big plantations, so this makes them feel important because they're like, hey, we want to be in with the cool crowd, I guess. We don't want to be a backwater colony. We want to be, city mice.
Sure.
And now the king is here. Go ahead.
Yeah, and it was just that it was something very important context that you're adding there, which is this is in beginning of 1800s. So Brazil was encountered by Pedro Alvares Cabral in 1500. So, and the colonization began a few decades after that. So we're talking about let's say 200 plus years, basically since Brazil was discovered. Actually, 300 years since Brazil was discovered, but 200 plus years since it was first colonized. So it's not something that the colonization happened and then the king arrived, 50 or 100 years later. This was like 250 years later plus. Yeah.
Yeah. And for a long time, Brazil was the crown jewel of the Portuguese Empire. You're talking about for the 1700s, it was the gold. I mean, It was because of Brazilian gold that Dom João the fifth was able to build Mafra, the cathedral. This is what kind of kept the Portuguese riches going. And then, after the gold, it was the diamonds. And the late 1700s, we had the diamonds. So this is like, so now they're finally feeling like, okay, we have felt like we've been the most important part of the empire, and now we feel like they see it too. And so they were very excited. They're very excited to have the king there. They're excited to be a part of the kingdom. And Dom João seemed to like Brazil a lot. So in fact, fast forward to 1815, when Napoleon is finally defeated. Sorry. Sure,
that's fine. Yes, you're a business person. Listen, everybody knows that. A historian, but also a business person.
Yes.
And you have a business to keep up so people can have a job.
Exactly. So we fast forward to 1815 when Napoleon is finally defeated. And meanwhile, the British had a regency in Portugal, and the Portuguese are getting a little restless. They're not happy with the British. They weren't exactly nice. And so Napoleon's defeated. The British send a message to João and they say, hey, coast is clear. You can come back. And João says, no, I'm going to stay here for a little while longer. I'm sure he's enjoying the warm weather. Maybe he's learning how to make caipinhas and dance the lambada. I don't know. But whatever it is, he likes Brazil a lot. And
it was even though it's not the Brazil of today, it was always such a beautiful country, I'm sure even prettier before the development, as far as, some of the beaches in the area was concerned. Yeah.
Yes. And I mean, Portugal is beautiful too, but for whatever reason, João was just loving being in Brazil and was not in a hurry to go home. So he stays.
Just imagine though, also, Monique, he didn't have all those pesky aristocrats around him that always wanted something from him. In Portugal,
he did have some, yeah, but
not as many as the old guard in Portugal.
And I'm sure things were a little more relaxed. I mean, when you're in the tropical paradise, probably it's not as stuffy. And so he really enjoyed it, and he just decided to stay. Now, meanwhile, of course, he has two sons. He has Pedro and Miguel. Pedro is with him in Brazil. Miguel's back in Portugal. And in 1820, the Portuguese are sick and tired of their king being in Brazil. And they said, we're tired of the British. You're a Portuguese king. You need to be in Portugal. And they revolted against the British. And they gave João an ultimatum and said, get your booty back to Portugal and be king of Portugal, or we'll find you another king. Meanwhile, Miguel is going, I'll do it. He actually did try to revolt against his dad and ends up getting exiled to Switzerland. I love Miguel. He's so crazy. But so João was like, okay, we want a constitution. This is when constitutionalism is becoming very prominent in Europe. And we want a constitution, and we want our king back. If you like Brazil so much, you stay in Brazil. We'll find somebody else to be king. So João's like, okay, I'd rather be king in Portugal than not king in Brazil. So I guess I'll go back to Portugal. And so March of 1821, he makes Pedro the regent of Brazil and his son, and he goes back to Portugal. Now, before he left for Portugal, he tells Pedro he had a feeling that Brazil was going to want to fight for its independence. The independence movements had been moving through Latin America already, so this was kind of a trend. But João's biggest fear was that Brazil was going to become a democracy, because that's what we had been seeing in these different countries gaining their independence, is that now they're becoming democracies, republics, which, democracy is not perfect either. There was a lot of mess with these independence movements, and it had nothing to do with democracy itself, which is the fact that people didn't know. They knew they wanted independence, but then once independence was achieved, they couldn't agree on what they wanted, to look like. So he tells Pedro, look, if I have a feeling Brazil's going to want to become independent, and if that happens, you take control of the independence movement, make sure that Brazil does not become a democracy. Do whatever you need to do. And Pedro says, okay, Dad. And so João goes back to Portugal, and Pedro stays in Brazil. Now, the Portuguese people are not totally happy, because why is the crown prince still in Brazil? He needs to be back in Portugal, number one. Number two, they want Brazil to go back to being a colony. They don't want Brazil to be part of the kingdom.
Sure.
And so, of course, the Brazilians are not liking that at all. They've been a part of the kingdom now for about 10 years, 11 years officially. And now to be relegated back to a colony feels like being demoted. And so essentially what happens is that in 1822, and the court, the parliament sends a letter to Pedro and tells him, you need to come back to Portugal. Your official place is here. You are the crown prince. You need to come back for your education. So, and this is a very dramatic moment. And so on September 7th, 1822, Pedro takes the letter from the parliament. He's gathered on the banks of the Ipiringa River, and he shouts, "Eu fico, I'm going to stay." And he takes his sword and he throws it into the banks to, be dramatic and, prove his point that he's going to stay. And this is essentially, now Brazilians count this moment as their moment of independence. And of course, there was a short war, which wasn't really a war. If you compare it to the other, definitely not as bloody or as prolonged. After a year, they finally just come to terms, because the British are very excited about this. They want Brazil to be independent from Portugal, because they hate that they cannot trade directly with Brazil. Just for a little context, at that time, if you're a colony of Portugal, you have to trade directly with Portugal, because that's like dealing with somebody's child.
Sure.
Instead of dealing with the parent, right?
Sure.
Then once Brazil becomes independent, they can get whatever they want from Brazil and cut Portugal totally out of the picture. So they stick their money, they stick their nose, and they help arrange everything. So this all worked out very well to Britain's standards, because they helped the Brazilians fight against Portugal. And the Portuguese were kind of like, there's no point fighting this. We're just wasting money and killing people. So let's just give up. But
I kind of maybe might get my history wrong, but I think the British weren't that excited when the colonies, when this little small country that all of a sudden, one of these 13 colonies wanted to be independent. They weren't very excited about that, were they?
No, and that was about face, definitely.
Sure.
But yeah, so when to them, they're not excited, but when it's from somebody else, then they are.
Right. Yeah. 50 years later, well, we have a different concept on it. Yeah.
And even though the loss of the North American colonies for them was more of a loss of face than anything else, because what did we have here? Tobacco and cotton. It wasn't really much to fight over. Brazil had the diamonds and the gold. That's what they wanted.
Indeed. And so September 7th, this dramatic act basically became the symbol for Brazilian independence, and Pedro became the first, Emperor of Brazil?
Emperor of Brazil, yes. And that's kind of really what that moment is, a very defining moment in Brazilian history, because if you look, he becomes the Emperor of Brazil. Eventually he abdicates in favor of his son. There's a whole nother story about, his daughter and being Queen of Portugal. But even after Brazil gets its independence, it gets not its independence, but becomes a republic in 1888. This becomes this is what shapes Brazilian society to this day, because it became a very fixed program of the elites still on top and the non-elites. So you have these people who had these huge tracts of land that they had been given by the Portuguese king over centuries, and then they maintained the ownership of that land. And why to this day, you see this very big difference in Brazilian society, where you have a very small amount of people who own the majority of the land, and you have a large amount of people that own no land in Brazil. And it's all based from that moment as staying as an empire. So even though technically they're not Portuguese anymore, but they kind of maintain the same structure that they had inherited.
Indeed. And so the British were excited about it. The other Europeans, mixed feelings, probably, or,
I don't know if it really
just
affected them that much.
that
Yeah,
much. Okay.
but
It
they
affected
were,
more of the British because they were looking at a strong trade partner
yeah,
that they didn't have to go through Portugal for. Even
exactly.
though they were our best friends.
Right. And yeah, we're more like frenemies, like Mean Girls. Uh, but and you see the British influence in a lot of the Latin American independence
Sure.
movement. I mean, they're
Sure.
the ones that helped build the trains in Argentina and all these different things. This was their motive all along because they wanted to be able to deal directly with Latin America without having to, but then of course what foils all that is the United States.
Sure.
You
American
know,
independence. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, and well, once the United States becomes a strong country, and of course we get the Monroe Doctrine, where we kind of say, hey, Latin America is our little brother, stay out of it. If anybody's going to manipulate them, it's going to be us.
Yeah, you guys are too far. We're
Yeah,
close.
go away, go mess with Africa.
Yeah, that's right. That's where they went anyway. and Asia.
We could be exploiting around here in this country.
Well, Monique, again, thank you, and really timely, because indeed we are going to be doing PBBI, Fresno State, and CSU Stanislaus are going to be doing a program on Brazilian independence and the theme of independence, basically. And so it's very, very timely, and promise me that maybe between now and the end of September, we have a while, that we can talk about the fascinating story that you said about Imperador Dom Pedro, and then, of course, his son and his daughter being in Portugal. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that story one day between now and the independence of,
sure.
as we commemorate the independence of Brazil.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. And we'll see you next week. Thank you so much. And thank you all for being part of this history segment, a weekly segment here of PBBI, the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute, with Dr. Monique Kelly-Vallance, a PhD in Portuguese history from the University of California in Santa Barbara. Take care, everyone. We'll see you next week. Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you all.